Okay, we are back on Infowars.com, the Alex Jones Show. I'm Aaron Dykes filling in on this March 2nd, 2011, and I'm honored to be joined by Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. He is the father of Reaganomics and a former head of policy at the Department of Treasury during the Reagan years. He's a columnist, a former editor for the Wall Street Journal. He's testified on numerous occasions to congressional committees. He's written or co-written over 8 books, and his latest, How the Economy Was Lost, The War of the Worlds, details why America is disintegrating. Dr. Roberts, thanks for joining us.
Glad to be with you, Aaron.
Hi, yeah, you may not remember me, but I was out there interviewing you, I believe, just over a year ago.
I remember very much.
Nice to talk to you again. Well, if we could break down the oil price tensions in the Middle East and what you think is going on with Libya, or whatever else you'd like to get into first, sir.
Well, Libya, if the revolution continues to succeed, we'll probably have a more complete revolution than Egypt. In Egypt, it was peaceful in the sense that the protesters or the revolutionaries did not bring violence to bear. And nothing really changed except 1 or 2 people at the top. The entire ruling class is intact, the bureaucracy is intact, the American embassy is still there. And so it remains to be seen where Egypt is going to be much different than before. In Libya, thanks to the Gaddafi's mistake, he's forced violence upon the protesters, and parts of the military have gone over to the revolutionaries, and many of the members of the Gaddafi government, including apparently one of his sons, have defected. And so if this war, which is now going on, succeeds, the clearing out of the upper crust in Libya will be more complete, and there'll be more chance for real change rather than just another representative of the existing powers. So that's my take on Libya. The oil price is being attributed to the discontent, which is widespread in the Middle East, and no doubt this is part of it, but it could well be another part, or the new investment devices that Goldman Sachs came up with in 2008 that has introduced massive speculation into commodity markets. Until just a few years ago, speculators in commodity markets had position limits imposed on them by regulation, so that speculation could never determine the outcome of the markets. It was only a relatively small part of the participants. The market consisted largely of growers in the case of grains, and producers in the case of oil, and then the users, the cereal companies that wanted the grains, and the refinery companies that wanted the oil. And so speculators were just like a middleman to be sure that supply and demand stayed in balance. But with changes that Goldman Sachs got passed, the regulators, it then became possible for speculators to dominate the markets. And you may remember in 2008 when the oil price ran way up. It went up from something like $30 up to $140 something.
Right.
And there was no supply shortage. There was no increase in demand. It was all the result of this new financial speculative instrument that Goldman Sachs had got the regulators that it controls to approve. So now you have this new reason for prices to rise. In fact, that's what's happening to world food prices. That's why now there's so many people are starving due to the push-up in the grain price. A lot of people will say, oh, it's all because of ethanol, and that's a part of it. But the main part is that the investment banks in Wall Street got the laws changed so that speculation can now dominate the commodities markets. So it's another contribution that Wall Street has made to our welfare and the welfare of the world.
And it's amazing how the monster that created the true economic crisis just continues to thrive and take more victims. But we know oil's obviously going to go up in the short term, and we know it's tied to the dollar as reserve currency. Of course, that's been one of the biggest issues in the past 2 years. Where do you see the current stuff going on in the Middle East? What do you see that affecting the long-term issue of whether or not the dollar can or will remain the reserve currency, and what else might come in its place?
Well, you know, Aaron, it's ironic. But if these revolutions succeed in the Middle East, and these Arab countries actually get governments that are not American puppet governments, and that are not part of the American empire, and don't serve American hegemony in the Middle East, it could actually result in saving the dollar, because we might have to withdraw and give up the unaffordable effort that we are making to achieve military hegemony over the world. That's what's bankrupting us. That's what's bankrupting us, and that's what's driving the dollar down from all the money creation that's part of funding a $1.5 trillion budget deficit, of which $1.1 trillion is the military security complex. So if these lands succeed and they actually do get independent governments that are responsive to their own people rather than to Washington, it will make the American effort to dominate the Middle East redundant. It'll be finished. We won't be able to dominate it without the puppets. And therefore, that could actually help us save the dollar and change our whole approach to the world and scale back the military security complex and get the budget deficit under control. It would be a very good thing.
Well, that's certainly been the elephant in the room, but I would imagine we're still a long way off from scaling back that empire. But I was very encouraged that Ron Paul was not the only voice during the CPAC conference, which was around the time the Egypt stuff was unfolding, to call for scaling back the troops and suggest that maybe we shouldn't be subsidizing dictators only to replace other bad governments in the region to try to impose our will. What do you think about the calls that are at least on the agenda is something about cutting back this empire, if only for the debt and deficit sake?
Yes, well, you know, Ron Paul, I think, is a sincere person, and he's making the point from the standpoint of liberty and freedom. I don't know how many of the people who might line up with him will have that same motive. There are other motives that are causing people to become less tolerant of all the wars, and that is what's happening to the dollar, because some of them are beginning to realize that the power of the United States really rests on the dollar as reserve currency, and if they lose that role, we can no longer exercise the kind of influence and power we have. We would lose control over the international financial system. Some of them are also beginning to realize the implications of $1.1 trillion military security annual budgets when you have $1.5 trillion deficits. And the implication is, if you're going to continue to have that kind of a military security budget, you're going to have to act Social Security and Medicare. And so and some people are already calling for that. So when they are presented with the notion that they're going to have to renege on benefits, that the American workforce is paid 15% of their payroll for their entire working lives, that they're going to take this away. Why? So they can pay for wars? So that's producing others who come to Ron Paul's side of it. But that motive is different from Ron Paul's motive. He, I think, has the motive that it's just purely liberty and freedom. So we have others coming to him who are beginning to see that the cost of the wars may be paid by decimating Social Security and Medicare, and others who see that the war is threatening the dollar as reserve currency. So yes, a coalition could build, but it would be up against the very powerful military security complex, which can finance opponents in political campaigns of those people trying to reduce the war. And it's hard to say who would prevail in that type of a struggle. And also, I think the CIA is committed to the wars. And it's committed to the puppet governments because its influence is everywhere. It penetrates everything. And so who knows? We may have other false flag events that make it impossible to curtail the wars because people get all enraged again. And we could have false flag events that make the politicians around Ron Paul who are trying to begin thinking about how to wind these wars down, to make them look like they're not patriotic, or they're not aware of the real threat, or they're not going to support the troops and the war on terror. So the game is far from over. You know, the problem, Aaron, is that those forces in the government that have these hidden agendas have gotten away with so much. They're very audacious now, and there's no end to their ability to pull off false flag events that would further their goal of continuing the wars and continuing the effort to acquire hegemony.
It's outrageous, but I totally agree. We would expect to see more false flag action, as you say, in the region to keep our troops overseas. It's just sickening. I feel like we should shift gears to get into your most recent article from today, The Perfidy of Government, Evidence versus Denial. And if you could get into that, sir, but along with the Pentagon, who's tried to blame parts of the 2008 financial crisis on supposed terrorists, on supposed hostile foreign nations, as if we don't know who's running the derivatives from Wall Street, from the City of London, and the other financial centers. Could you get into that, sir?
Well, of course, you know, it's bin Laden running the derivative market out of a cave in Afghanistan.
I don't even know how they can make that claim.
Yeah. Yes, I'll be glad to do that. First, let me say that I think the most exploited part of the American population is the military families. They're the ones who are being used for hidden agendas to fight wars in behalf of mega-rich armaments industries and in behalf of the neoconservatives' ideology of hegemony. And then no one is as brutally exploited in the United States today than the armed services and the military families. They're the ones who are suffering the most from the perfidy of their own government. Now, the column that you spoke about is simply just a book report on 3 books. I'm simply reporting the nature of 3 books, which I think would wake up any American as to what is happening in front of their eyes. One book is by Matt Taibbi. It's called Griftopia. It was published in 2010. That is just a couple of months ago. And it shows the inside story of the financial crisis, how it all came out of deregulation of the financial market, driven by Wall Street itself, the investment banks such as Goldman Sachs, and by the idiocy of top policymakers such as Alan Greenspan, the Fed chairman, the head of the SEC, Arthur Levitt, and the various secretaries of the Treasury, from Rubin all the way through the current one, through Paulson to Geithner. And the policies of Greenspan are being continued by Bernanke. So what the story that Tabby tells is how our top policymakers and the powerful investment banks deregulated the financial markets so they could rip off everybody. And they succeeded. Massive fraud, massive criminality, not just on the part of the investment banks, but also on the part of the public policymakers. And no one's been held accountable. They got away with it. The next book that I take up is by Charlie Savage. It's called Takeover. Charlie Savage is a summa cum laude graduate of Harvard with a master's degree in law from Yale Law School, and he documents the destruction of American civil liberties and of the constitutional separation of powers by the Bush-Cheney regime. He goes through it and gives every inch of the story, shows who the culpable parties are, such as John Yoo and Bisbee. Bisbee is now a federal judge. John Yoo holds a tenured position at the Bolt School of Law at the University of California, Berkeley. And so we are now rewarding with prestigious positions the people who are absolutely inimical to American civil liberties and to the Constitution.
Okay, Dr. Roberts, we are hitting a break. We'll be right back on the other side, and certainly we're going to hear more about how government has hijacked for the interest of a narrow band of people at the expense of us all. We'll be back, Infowars.com. Okay, we are back in the last segment with Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. Any way you look at it, everything to do with the economic crisis was bending the rules for the benefit of a few elites. And now we're, closing down on pensions, taking back things, as you point out, people have put money into for decades, but they don't hesitate to give money to Wall Street, and that's just part of your article on the perfidy of government. But switching back to Libya, I forgot to ask you, do you expect to see a U.S.-backed intervention in the region, sir?
I don't know. I think that we'd probably like to do that so we can leave them with a puppet government. But unless, Gaddafi can stall his own fall long enough for us to create all this concern about humanitarian lives and so on that we would use as a cover, it would take a longer period of rebellion for us to be able to get in there, in my opinion. Let me use our last few minutes to get to the third book.
Yes, sir.
Perfidy of Government, and that is the most remarkable book of all. It's by James Douglas. It came out, I think, 2 years ago, maybe 3. It's called JFK and the Unspeakable. And of course, JFK is President John F. Kennedy. And what Douglas does is to prove beyond any reasonable doubt that Kennedy was murdered by the CIA. He proves this several times over. He proves it first with declassified top secret documents that have been coming out over the years. He proves it by the testimony of eyewitnesses who were excluded, whose testimony was excluded from the Warren Commission report, and who were silenced with threats all of their lives until old age, when they had nothing else to live, and they came up and started talking, and there's so many of them, and the story is always the same. And he then proves it by overwhelming circumstantial evidence. And so we have a situation, and it happened in this way. Kennedy was brought face to face with reality by the Cuban Missile Crisis, because he saw that he and Khrushchev were on the verge of pushing a button that would have annihilated the world, certainly the United States and the Soviet Union. And he was being pushed in that direction by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And he resisted, and he found he was isolated in his own government, and he had to turn to Khrushchev through back channels for help. And Khrushchev was feeling the same pressures and having the same reactions, and realized sincerity in Kennedy and made the public announcement he would withdraw the missiles. And Kennedy made the public announcement the United States would not invade Cuba. Well, this incensed the military security complex, the CIA, and the Secret Service that was supposed to be protecting Kennedy, because he had already pulled the plug on the Bay of Pigs and not sent in the Air Force. He was trying to open connections to Castro. He had the nuclear test ban treaty with Khrushchev, and Kennedy was seen from within his government as soft on communism, a security risk, somebody who was selling out the country to Soviet deceptiveness.
Dr. Roberts, we're running out of time. We really appreciate you joining us. And I totally agree. There's so many hundreds of data points connecting the CIA to the JFK thing, including how they had a team on the ground during the missile crisis. We'll have to get into that some other time. The rebroadcast is starting right after the end of my voice. Alex Jones is on the show, Paul Watson, and we break down the Middle East. Infowars.com.